Welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, January 2nd, 2023, and in just 2 weeks, the Iowa caucuses are set to occur, which means it's time for a 2024 Republican primary election prediction. Before I get into my prediction, I want to do a huge shout out to the Discord server that has been running for quite some time now since the 2020 election. You can join it at discord.gg/LTE, and it is the #1 place for news and elections, and they actually have a brand new bot that I'm super excited about that actually does live updates and will be accompanied by graphics in the Discord server that will be used for Iowa, New Hampshire, etc. So you know the gist, you know what this is about. This is for news, elections, and general conversation, so I highly recommend that you join. The link is at the end of every single video at my end closing screen, but also right now, discord.gg/LTE. It'll open it right up either in your browser or in the Discord app, so make sure you join, and you can connect with everyone there, including myself. So let's go ahead and get right back into our prediction for the 2024 GOP primary process, which is the actual purpose of this video. And so, to preface, we are going to be starting with a lot of the early states and spending a lot of time talking about that simply because after around a point at the end of South Carolina and Nevada, we probably won't be hearing much from the candidates Chris Christie, Vivek Ramaswamy, and potentially Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis further out from that. And the reason for that is because these early primary states are often indicators about the longevity of elections and how they can be ran by individual candidates and how long these candidates can run, can stay in the running, whatever you want to say, how long they are relevant, essentially speaking. And so when states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada sort of come to fruition and you see the results poured out and displayed on a national screen, not only do these candidates internally know that they are either done for or have a realistic shot at the nomination, it also tells the public and who they should support, which means momentum gets built. If people see their candidate tank in a GOP primary, they probably aren't going to be backing them in the next primary because they know that it doesn't make sense for that to happen, because you're not going to back somebody who will have no impact on the general election platform, no impact at the convention, and no impact or chance at actually winning the nomination. What I will say, though, is that there are candidates uniquely to this race that are very much vehemently opposed to Donald Trump. People like Chris Christie, who arguably based on his national numbers, where he's polling presently speaking at just around 4% nationwide, should have dropped out weeks, if not months ago, but refuses to do so because of their strong dislike for Donald Trump. It will get to a point, though, that in the primary process, candidates will remove themselves out of the race, not because they personally want to stop running, but because there is no backing for them. Their staff leaves, their advisors leave, their donors leave, and everybody vacates the campaign, and so they have to as well. And so with all of that being said, we are again going to be talking about these early primary states pretty intensely, getting all the way up through Super Tuesday, and then from then talking about the implications of it and what will be the future. So, to begin, in around 13-14 days, Iowa's caucus's results will be tabulated and published, hopefully speaking a lot better than they were back in 2020, that will tell us the beginning of this ever-evolving story since the 2020 election when Donald Trump lost re-election. And so, to begin, we are going to talk about the state of Iowa. Like I said, this is a state where Donald Trump actually has been polling quite well in, but not as well as he is nationwide, which is a little bit interesting that some of these early primary states are not as strong for former President Trump. Now, I will not be using the polling averages for every single state. I promise you that's not going to happen, and I'm not going to bore you by doing that. I have all these numbers compiled. I don't know if you can hear my note pages here, but I've pretty much written out exactly how all of the states are going to go and what my predictions are and the type of allocation that the states are going to go by, because that matters in these states. Because in one case, back in 2016, I talked about this in my earlier video today, Donald Trump won just 30% of the vote in South Carolina, got 100% of the delegates because the votes were split. So that's just something we're going to keep in mind, something we think about when we move forward in some of these states. But right now, Iowa is a state where Donald Trump is on track to get roughly 55% of the vote, considering that there's very few undecided voters, but I expect between now and 2 weeks from now, the numbers to slightly improve. And so that brings Donald Trump to around 55% of the delegate count, because Iowa is a proportional state, first in the nation. It should be that way, in my personal opinion. Nikki Haley's coming in around second place, around third place. Ron DeSantis slated to do slightly better. He will probably get around 20% of the vote. Nikki Haley around 18% of the vote. Vivek Ramaswamy is still in the running in this state, expected to get roughly 5% of the vote. And Chris Christie probably going to do worse than Vivek Ramaswamy. And so off the initial bat here, Donald Trump takes a strong lead with 22 delegates. Nikki Haley's at 7, DeSantis is at 8, Ramaswamy's at 2, Christie is at 1. And thus, the story begins. We move over to the state of New Hampshire, where surprisingly enough, Nikki Haley has been doing a lot better than all of the remaining candidates besides Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump starts off strong with roughly 44% of the vote, but that's actually one of his weakest states early on. It is another state that is proportional, and it absolutely matters for the outcome of this election. And Nikki Haley, on the contrary, is doing much better than she is in other states. She gets roughly 30% of the vote based on where she is right now. Ron DeSantis gets around 9% of the vote, but probably will do around 13%. And with this remaining allocation, Ron DeSantis is at 9%. Chris Christie actually is the one who is doing better than Ron DeSantis, getting around 13.64% of polling and probably, of course, eventually the vote. Ramaswamy is not doing well at all in this state. He's polling in a pretty poor place. He's around 6%, but of course, as the delegate count gets slashed and as it gets distributed, he probably won't be getting that amount when it comes down to the actual election. But where we are right now, Trump at 45%, Haley at 32%, Ron DeSantis at 9%, Christie at 13.64%. So again, the map shaping up to be a race for second place. Haley and DeSantis 14-10, Christie at 4, Ramaswamy at 2, and Donald Trump in the lead with a whopping 32 delegates. Moving over, this is February now, so the January primaries and caucuses are out of the way. Iowa happened, New Hampshire happened. Now we're into February. February 8th is when Nevada and the Virgin Islands happen. So the Virgin Islands, I'll start off with not that many delegates here, around 9. They're allocated on a similar way as the rest of the country, and you will see here that Donald Trump is going to do quite well. He did very well here in years past, and you see that he's going to get around 77% of the vote. DeSantis and Haley will probably split individual delegates from the remaining voting pool here, which will bring Donald Trump up to 39 and them up marginally. But the big one is the state of Nevada. Now, the reason why this matters is because in an early primary state or an early caucus state, it's a bit of a point of contention here, which I will get to in just a moment. It's important for everybody to be on the ballot everywhere. And you would think all these candidates have been at numerous primary debates. They've been at numerous states in Iowa and New Hampshire, and they are focusing heavily on it. But Nikki Haley made a mistake. Her campaign registered for Nevada's primary. Now, you might be thinking, what's wrong with that? Well, the state legislature, which is controlled heavily by Democrats, it's a very gerrymandered state. Democrats have an overwhelming majority there, and so they passed a law that requires primaries to be held, not caucuses. And so the problem that the RNC has with that is that they say, no, we want to do things our way, but Nevada has a law that requires a primary. So the Nevada GOP made a decision. They will host a caucus 2 days later rather than a primary, and the primary will be non-binding, and anyone who registers for it cannot compete also in the caucus, sort of as a display of showing the national party and the state legislature, hey, we don't agree with this decision. This will have no impact on our primary. You're wasting tax dollars by hosting it, and you're confusing voters along the same lines. And so Nevada now has a four-way race between Vivek Ramaswamy, Chris Christie, Donald Trump, and Ron DeSantis, and Nikki Haley is nowhere to be seen on that ballot because she is being taken off. In fact, it isn't a ballot, it's a caucus, but you know what I'm trying to say. And so Donald Trump will get a whopping, and is expected to do so based off current polling data, but I am bumping up his numbers because, again, a lot of Haley supporters also are very much Trump supporters in their second or third choice. He's going to get around 75% of that vote. And Nevada, as a state where this does have an impact, it is, technically speaking, proportional, but a huge benefit to Donald Trump. He gets 76% of the vote. Ron DeSantis will probably get the remaining 19%, and then maybe you will see Chris Christie with the remaining 4%. Vivek Ramaswamy in this state does not seem to be polling in anywhere close to relevancy, and so thus Donald Trump wins the state by a whopping margin because Nikki Haley simply is not on the ballot. And so you move over next to the state of South Carolina, where Nikki Haley's probably going to capture back some of those delegates that DeSantis is already taking amount over her, but you see here that Donald Trump, again, is taking this race away. South Carolina is a state where you're going to have Nikki Haley do well simply because she was the former governor, but not too well. Donald Trump's on track to get 44 of the delegates here. Nikki Haley will probably get around 6. You might be thinking, okay, how's that possible? He's getting 88% of the vote? No. It's a state that does a winner-take-all primary, but it's winner-take-most, meaning he wins the statewide vote, wins all of those delegates, but they are broken down by congressional district. I think Nikki Haley, because she has the former governor status and has a well-known rep across the state and has been polling quite well, can reasonably get a good chunk of support across 2 congressional districts, enough to potentially win over those delegates. But there's even a situation where she wins 0 of them and Trump wins 50. But right now, I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that South Carolina, in some parts of the state, some parts of the region, are beneficial for Nikki Haley, giving her 6 delegates out of the state's total 50. But now Donald Trump is already at triple digits. Everybody else is starting to fade off. And around this point is when I would say Chris Christie and Vivek Ramaswamy are no longer in the race. They no longer matter, and they no longer are going to be on the primary, in the same way they were before. I think this is the point where you really start to see these campaigns have their own staffers, advisors, and donors abandon them because they simply don't see a pathway forward. Mathematically speaking, logistically speaking, whatever it might be, they are out of the race. And so we take Ramaswamy, Christie, take them out. Their delegates don't get reallocated, but you have a remaining remaining number of states that need to hold primaries. They will still be on the ballot, by the way, but they probably won't have any voters. Maybe a few people will still do sort of like a protest vote for them, but again, they aren't going to have much of an impact. So we move directly into March. Everything's over. We move to Idaho and Missouri. Washington, D.C. has sort of like a 3-day primary. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but they are going to host a primary in which Donald Trump is likely to win every single one of these states. And the reason for that is because the Republican primary has a lot of states that are winner take most. And what winner take most means is that it isn't an absolute, like South Carolina, where you have, a lot of the vote going in one way. It is going to be very similar to that, but they allow for individual delegations to make a decision about how the remainder of the vote is counted. But if there is a situation in which one candidate is getting the majority of the vote in some states or winning the majority of the vote in congressional districts, they win all of those districts' delegates as well, which would mean in states like Idaho, where you aren't going to see governor, home state advantage, any type of influence in certain pockets of the state for either side, Haley or DeSantis, Donald Trump really does well because winning the outright majority in any of those districts allows him to build up this overall advantage that allows them to win in a winner-take-most state. So essentially, the way it works is they have a statewide primary, of course. They have statewide delegates. Then they have district delegates or whatever they want to decide is determining delegates. Maybe it's state Senate districts, state House districts, sometimes congressional districts. You get the gist. They do things their way. The Republican primary decides, and each state is a little bit different. But winner-take-most roughly has the same thing. The statewide delegates go one way. It's a winner-take-all system for whoever wins the majority there. But if certain candidates, for example, if Nikki Haley was to win Idaho's first district and get a majority there, but lost the statewide popular vote, she would still get some delegates from the first district. But that's not going to be the case. I'm sorry if that was confusing. I don't explain things super well, not all the time at least. So Idaho, I will say Donald Trump is likely to win all those delegates because of the winner-take-most system. He's also going to win Missouri. I don't think you're really going to see too much hope here for Ron DeSantis. In previous polling, though, which is interesting, back earlier on this year, he was doing quite well there. He's not doing quite well there now. He's roughly around 13% of the vote, so not expecting much for him. D.C. overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, as it was in previous elections. So now we get to a point where it's Super Tuesday. A very important, number of races, ones that will likely fill in a lot of this map and will be very, very important. Similar to some of the states that have already been decided, a lot of them are winner take most. Some of them are proportional, so we'll work with those as we will. But a lot of them are going to be decided simply based off who's winning the majority of the vote. If they're winning the majority of the vote statewide, they win all of the delegates. And again, some deal with congressional districts and a breakdown that way. But for most of them, it's just whether or not someone wins a majority. And if they don't, then it becomes proportional. But because Donald Trump is doing quite well nationally and would be, in fact, riding high based on where the numbers are currently, because he's already doing well, but can you imagine him with this huge delegate advantage? He'd be coming in with a huge mandate and momentum that would allow him to win a lot of these remaining states by larger margins, especially states where he was already expected to do quite well. So states like Alabama, Donald Trump wins. He wins states like Arkansas by an overwhelming amount. Let's go ahead and just move to the fill tool here so we aren't wasting time. He also wins California, a huge, huge prize that brings him to 466 delegates. California matters a lot. It is a winner-take-most system. Donald Trump is undoubtedly going to get the majority there. He's already polling at 60-70%. Donald Trump's on track to win in the state of Maine, win in the state of Massachusetts, win in the state of Minnesota, in the state of Oklahoma. Despite, what you find here, Ron DeSantis has received a lot of endorsements in Oklahoma. A lot of endorsements, including the governor, Kevin Stitt, in Oklahoma. Guess what? Ron DeSantis is polling around 12% in that state. So clearly endorsements don't matter as much as we think they do. Oklahoma goes towards Donald Trump in the blue column, which is interesting to say. Tennessee all goes to Trump. Texas, a state that Ted Cruz couldn't crack 50% back in 2016, couldn't make it a winner-take-all state. Donald Trump does just that. That gets him to 828 delegates. And then we have the remaining states, the ones that I haven't characterized that are on Super Tuesday, that are not winner-take-most, that are in some cases proportional or do have a little bit of a delegate situation. For example, American Samoa does an entire delegate delegation that chooses individually who they're going to vote for. But all of them are expected to go to Donald Trump. And so for the remaining states, we have Alaska, we have Colorado, we have North Carolina, we have Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. they're either proportional or have a different type of primary system that allows for the winner-take-most situation to not get into effect. Or maybe they have it, but the candidates aren't expected to get a winner-take-most scenario to benefit them too heavily. Candidates like Donald Trump, who aren't doing too well in some states, while doing very well in others. And so we'll start off with the state of Alaska, where you have Donald Trump getting roughly 45% of the vote here. Reminder that he lost this state to Ted Cruz back in 2016. Nikki Haley will probably come in second place across the state, and Ron DeSantis coming in a close third. But of course, Donald Trump still is able to win the majority of the districts here, win the majority, of the votes in this state. Not majority, plurality is the word I was looking for. That brings him to 13 delegates across the state of Alaska. Still a victory. Reminds me a lot of the Lisa Murkowski debacle back in 2022, but Alaska goes to Donald Trump. And so moving on to the next state that I mentioned, the state of Colorado. This is where Donald Trump will also do quite well in, but he also lost the state back in 2016. Donald Trump again will get roughly 45% of the vote here. Ron DeSantis actually will come in around third again. Nikki Haley will probably get the remaining chunk of the vote here. Let's see if we can make this a little bit more proportional, so it's a little bit more evenly split. Nikki Haley getting roughly 11 delegates, Ron DeSantis roughly 9, and of course, none of the remaining candidates, leveling out. But again, that race for second place is still going on. I do think Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis would stay through Super Tuesday, and I think this could be the end of their campaigns, because this is really the last stand for any of these candidates to make a name for themselves, and they simply aren't doing that. And so what we've seen thus far is that Trump is at 867 delegates. Nikki Haley's at 40. Ron DeSantis is at 32. We have a few more states to characterize, and then I can make my final real call here. North Carolina is a state where Donald Trump is on track to get roughly 70% of the vote. He'll do very well there, but it is a proportional state. Nikki Haley will probably come in with a strong amount of support, around 20%. Ron DeSantis in a distant third. You move over to the state of Utah. This is the one state where I think Ron DeSantis can actually win. And I know that's crazy to say, but I do think that because Utah is so vehemently anti-Trump, and I do think that, even though they voted for Mike Lee in that re-election, there was a lot of support that went to Evan McConnell, for all intents and purposes now is certainly not a Republican. I think DeSantis could do quite well here. Nikki Haley could do quite well here. I'm not going to go so far as to say that DeSantis is going to have an outright victory by a majority. I would expect him to get maybe 40% of the vote here, Trump roughly 35%, Nikki Haley getting the remaining, chunk of support. But I do think, looking at these numbers, I'm not super hopeful for Donald Trump. So I think that's the one shining beacon for Ron DeSantis. But beyond that, he really doesn't get much else. So looking at the last two states here, last two states, Vermont and Virginia, they really don't determine much, but they are proportional, and so they provide a little bit more context. I'll start off with Virginia. Donald Trump's doing quite well there. He's going to get roughly 65% of the vote there. I don't really have much of a reason to think that he wouldn't. Nikki Haley is also going to get around 15% of the vote, and then Ron DeSantis will probably get the remaining chunk, around 21%. And so Vermont is the last state where Republicans are not super locked in on Donald Trump. He gets roughly 45% of the vote there, but still wins in outright plurality. Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, of course, split the remaining chunk of support across the state, and I think you level yourself out to a point where Donald Trump still does very well, but of course, that race for second place is still continuing. And so this is the end of Super Tuesday. We're at a point where Donald Trump is at 973 delegates, Nikki Haley is at 77, Ron DeSantis is at 69, Chris Christie is at 5, and Vivek Ramaswamy is at 2. And for a bit more context, you need 1,234 delegates needed to win the nomination outright. 1,234. And after just the early states and the first Super Tuesday, Donald Trump is 300 delegates away. So at this point, I would expect Haley and DeSantis to subsequently drop out. I think this is where you see the turning point in favor of Donald Trump, to a point where there is no return for anybody else, which means all of the remaining states, regardless of where they are, regardless of how they may have voted if they were earlier on in the primary process, Donald Trump wins them. He wins them not because, they are states that overwhelmingly love him, which I'm sure many of them do, but it is because many of these candidates will no longer have a campaign to run with if they make it through Super Tuesday and perform the way they are expected to, the way they are polling and performing, and the way they are expected to in these early primary states that will likely dictate the remainder of this primary process. I could imagine Nikki Haley, instead of Ron DeSantis, wins the state of Utah. I don't think Donald Trump will come out ahead in that state, but of course, vote splitting is very real and very probable. That makes this map potentially a 50 state and numerous delegate, landslide across these districts and these commonwealths and these regions of the United States that aren't states. And I think Donald Trump will come away with this with a huge and massive victory in the GOP primary, one that may have initially seemed like there could have been a horse race, there could have been a more competitive race, but in reality, the race was never competitive to begin with Donald Trump receiving 314 delegates, Nikki Haley at 77, Ron DeSantis at 69, Chris Christie at 5, and Vivek Ramaswamy at 2. And you find here that overall, Donald Trump's getting 95% of the delegate count, despite not attending a single debate, despite not making a major, big deal out of all of these states, not investing as much in the states as Haley and DeSantis are, and ultimately showing that his name recognition, his, reputation, everything that he has done over the past 4 years has culminated in a re-election to the nomination and potentially a re-election in the general election. So that's where we are in terms of my prediction. I think this GOP primary has already been decided a year out in advance, and Donald Trump is on track to do very, very well. And these numbers look very different than what I think Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis ever really expected to happen when entering into the race, but that's how the cookie crumbles. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen is a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Republican primary analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.